What is the gospel? If we asked 10 people, we would probably get 10 different explanations. Most would make it about Jesus in some way or other. Some would focus on his 33-year life. Others, his 3-year ministry. Still others would just focus in on his crucifixion or his resurrection or both. All these aspects of the gospel are important, but I contend for the fact that all of them must be seen in the context of God's eternal plan from before the beginning of time. It is not just 33 years or 3 years or a day or 2 or 3. It's eternity. That plan has always been that God's life would dwell in human life. And Jesus is that plan realized in an historic way. But Jesus died that the plan could be implemented in our own lives, that God's life would come to each of our lives in personal ways, which is an ongoing history of another kind. So the question becomes, what do we believe about this gospel? This passage shows Jesus sharing the gospel in the life-in-life way, a way I want to advocate. In verses 1 to 2, we are introduced to Nicodemus, one of those people who believed because of the impressive signs that we read about at the end of John chapter 2. He was a vigorous, old Pharisee, an influential religious ruler of the Jews. He was a teacher, interested in what another teacher, Jesus, like himself, was going to teach. So he came to Jesus at night, fearing that his peers would not approve and that his leadership would be compromised if they knew. Matthew, Mark, and Luke make no reference to him. Yet he is mentioned twice again by John in chapter 7, where he defends Jesus, and in chapter 19, where he buries Jesus. Why did John describe this conversation so carefully? I believe it was because it fit perfectly into his Spirit-inspired aim to show Jesus as the life-in-life man of God, bringing the gospel, the good news of life in life to all people. So we can also ask, what is belief? This gospel encounter is described further in verses 2 and 3. We have just learned that many believed because of the impressive miracles, but that Jesus would not commit himself to them. Their belief was a result of seeing signs and wonders. But belief was more than being amazed at them, as was Nicodemus, who went on to praise Jesus for the miracles. Mark 1:24 tells us that the devil himself believed that Jesus could perform signs and wonders. James 2:19 says, the demons believe and they shudder. I want to pause here to say more about belief. The dictionary describes it in 3 ways: as principles, as convictions, or as trust. The first 2 appear in the realm of religion. The third one is connected to faith. The first 2 lead to a long list of beliefs. That's religion. But the third one leads to trust and faith in a person. A journalist visited a church and asked a member what he believed. The member said, "I believe what my church believes." The journalist pursued his question further. "But what does your church believe?" The man answered, "It believes what I believe." The journalist was not finished yet, and he asked, "But what do you and your church believe?" The man's answer, "We both believe the same thing." Many people are like that man. They don't know what they believe. They don't know the list. And that is the nature of religious belief. So you see, Nicodemus was a specialist in religious beliefs. He was a Pharisee with his list. He came to Jesus thinking he may have to add some beliefs to his list. And that's the religious way for many today. If we are not careful in gospel presentation, we will give people a list of things to believe, but fail to see them accept God's life through Jesus Christ. And that is what's so fascinating about the gospel encounter of Jesus in John chapter 3. Jesus was going to show Nicodemus that no list of beliefs, whether new principles to live by or new convictions to live for, none of them were adequate for belief that is trust. He was going to show Nicodemus that he needed more than a new belief. He needed a new life. That is the exciting gospel way of Jesus. Verses 3 and 4 show the interaction, the conversation of Nicodemus and the Lord. Nicodemus was always about religious human life. Jesus was going to always be about the need of divinely given life. And in that interaction, we can see how our own preconceived notions often make us blind and deaf to God's promised newness for our lives. Nicodemus was about life alone. He wanted life's truth explained. He wanted to see life's religious plans. He understood life's actions for birth. He wanted to add beliefs to his religion. Jesus was about life and life. He wanted divine life's truth known. He wanted Nicodemus to see life's eternal plan. He talked about life's action as a second birth. And he wanted to add life to the life of Nicodemus. We can see that Nicodemus, like us, had many preconceived notions about human life that made him deaf and blind to any teaching about God's life. As verse 4 shows, Nicodemus was bewildered because the Lord's response to his opening line of reasoning was unreasonable. There was no way for Nicodemus to continue his argument because Jesus seemingly began from nowhere and went nowhere familiar to Nicodemus. Nicodemus wanted to talk about human life as known to him, and Jesus kept on bringing in the subject of a life totally unknown to Nicodemus. You see, Nicodemus believed because of the signs and wonders, but he had not come to the belief that is essential, and that is trust in Jesus Christ alone. In verses 5 to 8, Jesus made 3 bold statements in response to Nicodemus. Let's consider them. First, Jesus said, "Unless one is born of the water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." He also said, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." And finally, he said, "The wind blows where it will, and so it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." Each statement provokes some very serious thought, but let's just keep to John's theme of life and focus on the difference and the relationship between human life and divine life, because this is exactly what Jesus did. Unless we know the difference between our life and God's life, we will not understand the relationship as planned by God in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Once again, Jesus declared authoritative truth to this man who just wanted to talk about opinionated interpretations of the truth. For example, Nicodemus was about life alone. He was probably remembering the Lord's violent entrance into the temple. But Jesus was about God's life in human life. And so he was concerned about Nicodemus' entrance into God's kingdom. Nicodemus knew about birth and water. Jesus knew about birth and the Holy Spirit. Nicodemus knew only one kind of birth, but Jesus knew 2 kinds of birth. Nicodemus was concerned for the processes of birth. but Jesus was concerned for the origins of birth. Nicodemus could relate to the flesh, and only Jesus could relate to the Holy Spirit. Nicodemus knew the works of the law, which led to religious life, but Jesus knew the works of the Spirit that led to new life and life. And Nicodemus saw it all in religious complexity, like the law. But Jesus saw it in gospel simplicity, and his illustration was like the wind. What is important to see is that Nicodemus wanted to talk about human life and correct belief, while Jesus turned every topic toward divine life and new trust. In verse 9, then, Nicodemus asked, "How can this be?" He was still seeking answers and discussion that explained human life. He was still dependent on his own previous knowledge. He had no clue that Jesus was giving a life-in-life explanation requiring entirely new knowledge. This is the dilemma that often rises in our own sharing of the gospel. And if we are not careful, we can neglect the Lord's way of answering such a question and fall into our own error of talking more about human life instead of divine life. We can add things like knowledge and doctrines, emotions, and even decisions to the life of another person. But if we fail to see God's life added to that life, we have missed the eternal aim of God for that life. Though a godly man, Nicodemus saw everything through the eyes of his human life. Jesus continuously brought him back to the necessity of seeing everything through the eyes of divine life. Nicodemus wanted to talk about that which he knew. For him, knowledge led to a better life, a better religious life. He sought more knowledge. Jesus kept bringing up the divine life he did not know. And for Jesus, that life led to the true knowledge everyone needed. In verse 10, Jesus answered, "How can you be Israel's leader and not understand these things?" Jesus knew the answer to his own question. Nicodemus had human life, but he had no divine life. He had some beliefs, but no trust. He knew that Nicodemus was caught up in getting Israel to follow the law in religious ways, but that he had no knowledge of the life that was the very source of that law. Nicodemus needed God's life in his life. In verses 11 to 15, we look once more at a set of contrasts between Nicodemus' small life-centered thinking and the Lord's big life-centered declaration of the gospel. A conflict between two lives was underway. And these verses help us to see that our evangelism does not set out to give people a spiritual life or a religious life, and that's a common presentation. Our evangelism sets out to give people divine life, an uncommon necessity. Nicodemus, as we said, was about life alone. And so he had no experience of God's life within. He rejected the testimony of Christ on earth. He tried to ascend to heaven by human righteousness. He knew salvation in a very limited religious way. And he contrasts with Jesus, who was about God's life in human life, because Jesus spoke of the life he knew and experienced. He was the source of the testimony from heaven. Jesus had descended from heaven as divine righteousness, and Jesus knew the salvation that was eternal for the whole world. The belief to which Nicodemus called people led them to a religious righteousness. It was about principles and convictions. The belief to which Jesus called people led them to eternal life, and it was about trust. So we have heard a lot and seen a lot of contrasts in this short message. The interaction between Jesus and Nicodemus was really incredible, and it was a clear indication of what the gospel and belief are.
Every time Nicodemus brought up human life, Jesus championed divine life. Every time Nicodemus tried to affirm his religious beliefs for human life, Jesus championed belief that led to divine life. Every time Nicodemus fell back on his dependence of human life alone, Jesus prompted him to realize the necessity of divine life in his life. That is real gospel presentation. The Lord's presentation of the life in life gospel is clear. Keep attention on the need for divine life. So the questions become, 1, what do we believe about the gospel? Number 2, is our gospel presentation clear? And number 3, do we need to improve our gospel message and ministry? In message 9, we will see how 2 believers aligned their testimonies with the Lord's presentation of the gospel. And that's something that we all need to do. Please go to that message when you are ready.